Have you ever wondered what would happen if Doctor Strange ended up in the boys' universe? Not a Strange who was passing through or temporarily displaced. A Strange who looked at the boys' universe with the full analytical capability of the Sorcerer Supreme, understood exactly what he was looking at within the first 24 hours, and decided that the specific combination of corporate manufactured superhumans and the complete absence of any mystical oversight infrastructure was a problem that required his particular kind of attention. Today we are finding out exactly what happens when the most strategically sophisticated magical mind in the multiverse sits down across from Butcher and starts asking questions that nobody in the boys' universe had thought to ask before. Before we get into it, here is what you need to understand about why Strange in the boys' universe was a different category of scenario from other powerful heroes arriving in that context. Batman had arrived and applied intelligence and preparation, and the specific discipline of someone who had turned limitation into methodology. Spider-Man had arrived and applied genuine heroism in the specific form of someone who showed up for the actual reason. Deadpool had arrived and applied the specific combination of capability and irreverence and underlying decency that Wade Wilson brought to every situation. Each of them had changed the boys' universe by being fully what they were in a context that needed what they were. Strange brought something different from all of them. He brought the specific perspective of someone who had spent years learning to see systems. Not just the immediate situation, but the architecture underneath it. The specific structural conditions that had produced the situation and would continue producing variations of it until the conditions themselves were addressed. He had learned this the hard way across countless iterations of the same fundamental problem in his own universe, and had developed the specific analytical patience of someone who understood that addressing the surface without addressing the underlying structure was not solving the problem but rescheduling it. He arrives in the boys' universe through a dimensional displacement that his own analytical framework identifies and categorizes within minutes of arrival. He does not panic. He does not perform any dramatic response to the displacement. He runs the assessment that the cloak of levitation has been running since the moment of arrival and cross-references it against what his own senses are telling him, and concludes that he is in a dimension that is adjacent to his own in certain structural respects and significantly different in others. He begins mapping the differences, because mapping the differences is the prerequisite for understanding what the dimension's specific needs are, and what his specific capabilities might be able to contribute to addressing them. The mystical landscape of the boys' universe is the first significant discovery. In his own universe, the mystical infrastructure was extensive and ancient and organized around specific principles that had been developed across millennia of interaction between human civilization and the dimensional threats it had periodically faced. The boys' universe's mystical infrastructure was sparse in a way that was not the sparseness of a world that had never had significant mystical activity, but the sparseness of a world where the mystical activity had been present and had been suppressed or misdirected or absorbed into frameworks that were not designed to accommodate it. Compound V read to his specific senses not simply as a biochemical intervention, but as something that was touching something underneath the biochemical level in a way that the people who had developed it had not fully understood they were doing. He filed this as significant and continued mapping. He found the boys through the specific combination of following the threads that his mapping had identified as the most active points of meaningful resistance to the dominant power structure. The boys were not the most visible resistance. They were the most structurally coherent, which from Strange's analytical perspective made them the most relevant. He observed their operation for 2 days before making contact, because observation before contact was the methodology that produced the most useful foundation for whatever the contact generated. Butcher received him in the specific way. Butcher received things that did not fit his existing categories, which was with the particular combination of wariness and direct assessment that was Butcher's version of taking something seriously. Strange did not perform any mystical demonstration to establish credibility. He sat down across from Butcher and said he had been observing the operation for 2 days and had several observations he thought were worth sharing, and that Butcher should decide after hearing them whether the conversation was worth continuing. Butcher looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Go ahead." What Strange shared in that first conversation was not a comprehensive briefing on mystical reality or dimensional theory, or anything that would have required Butcher to significantly expand his existing framework for how the world worked. He shared 3 specific observations about Compound V that his mapping had produced. 3 things about the substance that the boy's existing intelligence had not identified, because the boy's existing intelligence was operating within the biochemical framework, and the things Strain had identified were operating in a different register entirely. The observations were specific and verifiable, and connected directly to operational questions the boys had been struggling to answer. Butcher listened to all 3 and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you get that?" Strange said he had looked at it in a way that the tools available to the boys did not allow for. Butcher said he was going to need more than that. Strange said he understood and would explain as much as was useful at this stage. The team's responses to Strange established themselves across the first week in ways that reflected who each of them was. Frenchie's response was immediate and comprehensive fascination, with the intersection of mystical theory and material reality. Specifically, the way Strange described Compound V's interaction with the underlying substrate of what human biology was before and underneath the biochemical. He asked questions that were more sophisticated than Strange had anticipated from someone without formal mystical training, which was itself information about Frenchie's specific quality of intelligence when pointed at things that genuinely interested him. They spent 2 hours in technical discussion that covered more ground than Strange had expected to cover in the first week. MM's response was the professional assessment of operational utility. He looked at what Strange was describing he could do, and ran the rapid calculation of how those capabilities mapped against the operational requirements the team was currently facing. The assessment produced a result that he found both encouraging and slightly concerning. Encouraging because the capabilities represented significant additions to what the team could accomplish. Concerning because capabilities at this level tended to attract attention from the exact sources whose attention the team most needed to avoid. He said this to Strange directly. Strange said he understood the concern and that managing the attention his presence attracted was something he had experience with and could address. Said he hoped that was true. Kimiko's response was the one that produced the most significant early exchange. She watched Strange with the complete attention she brought to everything, and he was aware of being watched with it in the specific way that people with genuine mystical sensitivity were aware of. Certain kinds of attention, even when those kinds of attention were not mystical in origin. He looked at her directly after the first day, and she looked back, and there was a specific quality of mutual recognition between 2 people who had both had things done to them that changed what they were and who had built themselves on the other side of those things that did not require any additional words to be real. Strange said nothing, Kimiko said nothing. The recognition was sufficient for the moment, and both of them understood that what it eventually produced in terms of actual exchange would come when it came rather than being forced. Huey found Strange difficult to fully calibrate in the way he found most things that were operating at a level significantly above his own frame of reference difficult to calibrate. Not because Strange was condescending, he was not, but because the specific gap between what Huey understood about the world and what Strange was operating from made the normal conversational anchors less available than they usually were. Strange recognized this and did something that Huey had not expected, which was to ask Huey to explain how the boys' operation worked from Huey's specific perspective. Not from a strategic or analytical perspective, from the perspective of someone who was living it and experiencing what it cost and what it produced on a daily basis. He listened to Huey's explanation with complete attention, and without performing any response that suggested he was waiting for the explanation to reach the level of information he actually needed. He was interested in Huey's perspective specifically, and his interest was genuine, and Huey felt this, and found the conversation unexpectedly useful for something it had not been explicitly about. Starlight's response was the one Strange found most interesting from an analytical standpoint. She looked at him with the specific assessment she brought to everything, and found in him the same absence of gap between presentation and reality that she had found in the other genuine heroes who had come through this universe. But what she found underneath, the absence of gap, was something different from what the others had carried underneath it. Strange carried a specific quality of burden that was different in character from Spider-Man's wound or Batman's discipline or Deadpool's processed pain. He carried the burden of someone who had seen enough versions of enough situations to understand that the best available outcome was not always a good outcome. That the work was sometimes about finding the least bad option among options that were all bad. And that making peace with this without letting it produce either paralysis or the specific callousness of someone who had stopped caring about the specific people inside the general situation was the hardest ongoing work of his existence. She said to him that he looked like someone who carried a lot of things that were heavy and had found a way to carry them without letting the weight change his posture. He said that was one of the better descriptions he had heard of what the job actually was. She said she was working on something similar from a smaller scale. He said the scale was not the relevant variable. The working on it was the relevant variable, and she was clearly doing that. She said thank you. He said he meant it. She said she knew. The mystical assessment of Compound V was the work that Strange considered most important in the early period, and the work that produced the most significant results. What he had identified in his initial mapping was confirmed and expanded through more detailed examination. Compound V was not simply a biochemical enhancement. It was a biochemical intervention that was touching something in the human being at a level that the people who had developed it had not understood they were accessing, which meant the enhancement they were producing had a substrate underneath the visible capability that the boy's existing understanding of the subs had not accounted for. This substrate was not uniformly dangerous. In most cases, it was simply present, an additional dimension of what the compound's intervention had produced that was invisible to any analytical framework that was not looking for it. In certain cases, specifically the cases that had produced the most extreme capability levels, it was something more significant. It was a point of contact with something outside the purely human that the compound had opened, without anyone involved understanding they were opening it. He explained this to Butcher in terms that were calibrated to be useful, without requiring Butcher to accept a comprehensive new framework for how reality worked. He said that certain sups were not simply biochemically enhanced humans. They were humans who had been open to something that the compound had made accessible, and that something was now part of what they were in ways that the biochemical framework did not capture. He said this was relevant to the operational question of how certain sups could be addressed, because the standard approaches were addressing the visible capability without addressing the underlying access point, and the underlying access point was the thing that made certain sups significantly more difficult to address than the visible capability level alone would suggest. Butcher said he needed to know which ones. Strange said he could identify them. Butcher said that would be useful. The Homelander assessment was the one that Strange spent the most time on because Homelander was the most significant variable in the operational landscape and the most significant point of departure between the mystical reading and the conventional assessment. The conventional assessment of Homelander was organized around his physical capabilities, the laser vision, the durability, the strength. The specific combination that made him functionally unstoppable by any conventional means available to the boys. Strange's assessment produced something different. He identified in Homelander's specific substrate the dimension underneath the biochemical that the compound had opened. Something that was not simply an enhancement of human capability, but a point of contact with something that was using the contact in a way that was not neutral. He could not fully characterize what it was from the available access. He could identify that it was present, and that it was connected to the specific quality of Homelander's psychological instability in a way that the purely biochemical reading did not account for. He shared this with the team and added that it changed the strategic picture in a specific way. The conventional picture suggested that Homelander's instability was a psychological variable that made his behavior unpredictable within the range of what his capabilities allowed. The mystical picture suggested that the instability was connected to something outside Homelander's own psychology that was influencing it in ways that Homelander himself was not aware of. This did not make Homelander less dangerous. It made the specific question of how to address him more complex, because addressing him effectively required addressing not just the visible psychology and the visible capability, but the underlying point of contact that was influencing both. Butcher said he wanted to know if that meant Strange could do something about it directly. Strange said yes and no in the specific way that his assessments of complex situations often produced, which was a yes that was specific and a no that was also specific, and both of which required the full explanation to be useful rather than misleading. He said he could address the underlying contact point. He could not guarantee what that produced in Homelander's behavior, because Homelander had spent his entire existence developing a specific psychological architecture in response to the combined influence of the compound and the contact, and removing the contact's influence while the psychological architecture remained was not a predictable intervention. He said it was still worth doing because the contact's influence was directional in a way that was not favorable, and removing it made the psychological architecture Homelander had developed the primary variable rather than a secondary one. Butcher said he understood this was not a solution. Strange said it was a component of the solution and that the documentation strategy the boys were already pursuing remained the primary approach. The operational contribution Strange made to the documentation strategy was in the area that the boys had consistently struggled with, which was the security infrastructure around the most sensitive Vought documentation. The cloak of levitation, the sling ring. The specific combination of mystical capability and strategic intelligence that Strange brought to the physical access problem meant that the documentation the boys needed was accessible in ways it had not previously been accessible. He did not approach the access as a magical solution to a material problem. He approached it as a material problem that had additional dimensions that his specific capabilities allowed him to address, which produced a more complete solution than either the purely material or the purely mystical approach would have produced alone. He also contributed something to the broader strategic picture that none of the previous visitors to the boys' universe had contributed, which was a temporal analysis. He had spent enough of his own universe's history managing problems that had temporal dimensions to have developed specific methodologies for assessing situations whose current state was the product of decisions made far enough in the past that the current intervention's effects would play out across a timeline that extended well beyond the current operational horizon. His assessment of the boys' universe's situation suggested that the documentation release, while necessary and correct as an immediate action, was addressing a symptom of a structural condition that would reproduce the symptom in different forms if the structural condition was not also addressed. He mapped the structural condition and its probable reproduction pathways, and shared this with the team not as a reason to delay the immediate action, but as a reason to be thinking about what came after it while still in the process of producing it. Butcher received this analysis with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that were strategically significant and uncomfortable simultaneously. He said that what Strange was describing meant that even if everything they were doing worked exactly as intended, there was more work to do after it. Strange said yes. Butcher said he had figured as much. Strange said most people figured as much, and most people did not do anything differently as a result, because the more work after was too distant to feel as urgent as the immediate work. Butcher said he was not most people. Strange said he had concluded that, and it was one of the reasons the conversation was worth having with him. The intervention on Homelander's contact point happened during a period when the documentation release was already in process, and the institutional disruption it was producing had reached the state where the management layer between Homelander's impulses and their expression had thinned significantly. Strange had timed it for this period deliberately, because the management layer's thinning meant that the contact point's influence was most visible and consequently most accessible, and also because the effects of removing the influence would be most immediately observable in the behavioral changes it produced or failed to produce, which was itself information about the accuracy of his assessment. The intervention was not a confrontation. Strange did not approach Homelander directly. He worked from a distance through the specific mystical methodologies that allowed for contact with the underlying substrate without requiring physical proximity to the surface expression of it. Homelander felt something during the intervention without being able to identify what he was feeling, which was the specific experience of something that had been present for so long that its presence had become invisible, suddenly becoming absent. The absence was not comfortable. The specific psychological architecture that had been developed in response to the combined influence found itself in a slightly different context than it had been built for, and the adjustment period that followed was not smooth. But the directionality of the influence was gone, and what remained was entirely Homelander's own psychological architecture without the additional component, which was both less dangerous in certain respects and more directly addressable in the specific respects that the boys' strategy required it to be directly addressable. Strange observed the results of the intervention from a position that allowed assessment without exposure, and produced a report for the team that was more cautious in its conclusions than Butcher had hoped and more specific in its implications than Butcher had expected. He said the intervention had done what he had assessed it could do, and that the subsequent behavioral profile would be determined by factors that were now entirely within the human psychological and institutional domains rather than being partially influenced by the external contact. He said this was progress and not a solution, and that the distinction mattered for how the next phase of the strategy was designed. Butcher said he understood the distinction. Strange said he had concluded that he stayed in the boys' universe longer than most visitors had stayed because the structural work he had identified as necessary did not have a quick version, and he was not interested in starting something that he was not going to be present to see through to the point where the people who lived in the universe could carry it forward without him. This was not the same as seeing it through to completion, because completion was not a state that situations of this kind reached in any time frame that a single individual's presence could span. It was the specific point where the foundations he could contribute were in place, and the institutional and human capacity to build on them was present and operational. Reaching that point took the time it took, and he was patient in the way that only someone who had seen enough to understand that patience was not simply a virtue, but a strategic necessity could be. Patient. When he left, he gave the team something that none of the previous visitors had given them, which was a specific document. It was a detailed analysis of the structural conditions that had produced the boys' universe's current situation and the specific intervention points, where those conditions were most accessible to the kinds of actions the boys were positioned to take, organized by timeline and priority and the specific capabilities required for each. It was not a roadmap in the sense of something that guaranteed the destination. It was a map of the terrain in the sense of something that made the navigation more informed than navigation without it. He said the map was based on his best current assessment, and that new information would require updates to it, and that the updating was the work of people who were present rather than people who were passing through. Butcher looked at the document for a moment. Then he said it was the most useful thing anyone had ever given him professionally. Strange said he was glad and that he had tried to make it specific enough to be useful rather than comprehensive enough to be impressive. Butcher said it was both. Strange said he would take that. He left through a portal that he opened with the sling ring and stood in it for a moment before stepping through. He looked at the team assembled in the room and felt the specific quality of regard that he felt for people who were doing necessary work in difficult conditions with inadequate resources, and were doing it anyway with the specific stubbornness that was available to people who had run out of better options and had decided that the available option was sufficient. He had a considerable amount of regard for that stubbornness. He had depended on it in various forms across his own universe's history more times than he could accurately account for. He said the work mattered, and the people doing it mattered, and both of those things were true regardless of whether the work produced the results it deserved to produce, because the truth of things was not conditional on the results. Then he stepped through, the portal closed. The work continued because the work always continued, and the people doing it were the people who understood that it did and had decided to be there anyway.